Bob pulled his ragged coat tighter around his thin body as he pressed himself against the cold brick wall of the abandoned building. The wind whipped through the empty streets, biting at his skin, but he barely noticed. He had long since stopped feeling the cold. It was just another part of life on the streets, something you learned to ignore. Hunger, on the other hand, was harder to forget. His stomach growled in protest, but Bob didn't move. He had learned early on that the streets were full of predators, some with knives, some with hunger. It didn't matter which kind of predator you faced. You just had to keep your guard up. He'd spent 4 years living like this, 4 years without the warmth of a mother's embrace, without a bed to sleep in, without a place to call home. The streets had become both his prison and his only sanctuary. Suddenly, a shadow crossed the narrow alley, and Bob's heart skipped a beat. It was a man walking briskly, his face obscured by a worn cap. Bob instinctively ducked lower, hoping the man wouldn't see him. But then, the sound of footsteps stopped. Bob held his breath. Before he could react, there was a sharp cry, a man's voice, desperate and choking. Bob's eyes widened as he watched the man fall to the ground, blood pooling beneath him. The figure who had attacked him, a tall, dark silhouette, stood over him, knife in hand. The attack was swift, brutal. Bob's body froze as he watched the stranger's lifeless eyes stare up at the sky. The killer didn't even glance in Bob's direction, as if the boy wasn't even worth noticing. Bob's heart pounded in his chest, and his mouth went dry. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic, the world continuing around him as though nothing had happened. For a long moment, Bob couldn't move. He didn't know whether to run or to stay hidden, but his body trembled, and he finally took a step backward, making a soft sound. That was all it took. The killer's head snapped in his direction. Bob felt his pulse racing as he turned and ran. His legs, weak and hungry, moved as fast as they could, but his mind couldn't focus. His eyes darted behind him, and he saw the silhouette of the killer moving swiftly in pursuit. He knew he was being hunted now, and there was no one he could turn to. The streets, once familiar and comforting in their cold, chaotic rhythm, now felt like a maze of dangers. Bob had always learned to avoid trouble, to be invisible. But now, he was no longer just a shadow. He had seen too much. And in this city, when you saw too much, there were no guarantees of safety. He ran blindly, turning corners, ducking into alleyways, trying to shake off his pursuer. But the city, with all its twists and turns, offered no refuge. He could hear the footsteps behind him, getting closer. Every time he looked over his shoulder, he saw the same thing: darkness. Bob's breath came in ragged gasps, his lungs burning from the cold air and the frantic sprint through the city's winding streets. His legs screamed in pain, but there was no time to stop, no time to think. All he could focus on was the sound of the footsteps chasing him, steady, relentless, closing in. He darted around a corner, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed to lose the man. He needed to find somewhere to hide, a place where the killer couldn't find him. Bob's eyes scanned the alleyways, the graffiti-covered walls, the empty windows staring back at him like hollow eyes. The city had always been a maze, of sorts, but today it felt more like a cage. The footsteps were still behind him, faster now. He could hear them getting closer. "Please," Bob whispered to himself, his voice hoarse from the run. "Not today, not like this." He spotted an old, rusted fire escape ladder on the side of a building and made a split-second decision. Without thinking, he veered toward it, grabbing the bottom rung with trembling hands. His feet scrambled to find purchase on the metal rungs as he climbed up, pulling himself higher and higher with desperation. The clatter of the ladder echoed in the empty alley, and Bob prayed it wasn't loud enough to alert the man chasing him. His hands were slick with sweat despite the cold, but he pushed on, determined. When he reached the rooftop, he crawled onto it, ducking behind a broken air conditioning unit that offered the only semblance of cover. From his vantage point, Bob could see the street below, empty for now, but he didn't dare move. His body was shaking, not just from the cold, but from the sheer fear that gripped him. He had seen death, real death, the kind that haunted you, filled you with a terror that settled deep in your bones. Down below, he watched the figure of the killer pause in the street, Bob held his breath, watching as the man looked around, his dark eyes scanning the surroundings. Bob barely dared to blink, hoping to remain unseen. The killer took a few steps then, as though deciding it wasn't worth looking any longer. He turned and walked away. Bob didn't move for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. His heart was still racing, but he allowed himself a shallow sigh of relief. For now, he was safe. But the relief didn't last. His mind immediately began to race again. The killer knew he had seen something. That much was clear. Bob couldn't stay in one place for long. He had to keep moving. He couldn't risk staying here, on top of this roof, waiting for something to happen. He couldn't let this city swallow him whole. Bob slowly stood up, his muscles stiff and sore. He turned his back on the street, focusing on what lay ahead. The rooftops. There had to be a way out. He just needed to find it. The city was his prison, but it could also be his escape. The same concrete jungle that held him captive could be the very thing that gave him freedom. If he could navigate it, if he could stay one step ahead of the darkness. And so, Bob took his first steps into the unknown, no longer just a scared boy running for his life. He was becoming something else, something harder, something that wouldn't be as easily broken. But he was still just a child, alone in a world full of predators. And now, he was the prey. Bob's footsteps echoed softly as he crept along the rooftops. The city spread out below him like a vast, unknowable sea. His feet had begun to ache, the worn soles of his shoes scraping against the rough surface of the roof, but he ignored it. His mind was too focused on what had just happened, on the image of the killer's face seared into his memory. He tried not to think about the man's cold eyes, the lifeless body crumpled in the alley. The world had always been harsh, but that had been a new level of cruelty, even for the streets. Bob had seen his share of fights, of blood, but nothing like that. It was as if the man had been erased, his life stolen without a second thought. And now, Bob was the one who had been marked. He jumped from rooftop to rooftop, moving swiftly, hoping to lose the man, hoping that the distance would shield it. But there was something else tugging at his chest, a strange feeling that he couldn't shake. For all his attempts to outrun danger, he had yet to escape the memory of the death he had witnessed. He kept telling himself that the killer would stop looking for him, that he could find a place to hide, to disappear. But deep down, Bob knew that wasn't how it worked. There was no escape in this world. As he reached the edge of another building, Bob noticed a narrow alleyway between two tall, crumbling walls. It wasn't the safest option, but he needed a break. He was exhausted, and the fear gnawing at him was starting to take its toll. The alley seemed quiet, its only inhabitants the forgotten pieces of the city, the old, discarded furniture, broken bottles, and the remnants of those who had lived and died in the shadows. Bob slipped down the side of the building, his hands finding a ledge to grip as he carefully lowered himself into the alley. He didn't take long to settle into a crouch, hiding behind a pile of old crates. His breath came out in shallow bursts, each exhale visible in the cold air. That's when he heard it. A soft rustling noise came from the corner of the alley, followed by the quiet sound of a voice, almost a whisper, but clear enough for Bob to make out. "Hey, kid." Bob's body tensed, his eyes scanning the alley. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. The voice came again, more insistent this time. "Hey, I won't bite. Relax, all right? Just want to talk." Bob's instincts screamed at him to run. Trusting people in the streets was a dangerous game, but he was too tired, too hungry to run now. Besides, there was something in the voice, something familiar, something that told him this wasn't just another trap. He hesitated for a moment before slowly rising to his feet, his eyes flicking toward the source of the sound. In the shadows of the alley, he saw a figure, an older boy, maybe a few years older than Bob. He was thin, with scruffy hair, and a face hardened by the same life Bob had come to know all too well. His clothes were ragged, his shoes barely hanging on, but his eyes, there was a glimmer of something in them, something that Bob hadn't seen in a while. Hope, maybe even kindness. "You look like you've been running," the boy said, stepping closer but not too close, as if he understood the delicate balance between stranger and potential threat. "I'm not here to hurt you, all right? Just need to know, are you okay?" Bob stared at him, unsure whether he could trust this boy. The streets had taught him that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. But the boy wasn't demanding anything from him. He was offering something Bob hadn't felt in a long time, someone who seemed to care, even if just a little. I saw something, Bob whispered, his voice trembling as the memory of the murder flooded back. A man. He was killed. I saw his face. The older boy's expression hardened, but his eyes softened with understanding. I know. And that's why you need to be careful. The city's full of people who'll do anything to stay hidden. If they think you've seen something you shouldn't. Bob's throat tightened. He didn't want to hear this. Didn't want to think about what the killer might do if he found out Bob had witnessed the murder. But the boy's words rang true. He knew this life. He'd lived it. I don't know what to do, Bob muttered, his voice small and fragile. I'm just trying to survive. The boy gave a small nod, his face softened. I get it. I do. But you're not alone, kid. Not anymore. Bob looked up at him, still uncertain, but with a glimmer of hope beginning to form in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, he had found someone who could help him navigate this terrifying world. Someone who understood the rules of survival on the streets. All right, Bob said softly, almost to himself. What do I do now? The boy grinned, his eyes bright with determination. First, we get you out of here. We've got a few safe spots around. I'll show you. As Bob followed him deeper into the alley, the weight of the world on his shoulders felt a little lighter. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as helpless as he thought. Bob followed the older boy through the maze of alleys, keeping his head low and his senses sharp. The city seemed different now, even more alive with ever-present hum of traffic and distant voices. But in the narrow streets and hidden corners, there was a sense of quiet, almost a peace that Bob hadn't known for a long time. It wasn't the peace of safety, but the peace of silence, where only the strong and the wise could survive. You got a name? The boy asked, glancing at Bob as they walked. Bob, he replied, his voice still soft, cautious. He didn't know why he trusted the boy. He didn't know why he was following him at all. But something in his demeanor, something that wasn't harsh or demanding, made Bob feel like he could, just for a moment, put his guard down. Bob, huh? Nice. I'm Leo, the boy said, offering a quick, crooked smile. I've been around here longer than I care to admit. Been through the streets, the shelters, the corners of this city no one's supposed to know about. If you know how to stay quiet, you'll make it. Leo led Bob to an old, abandoned building hidden behind a line of overgrown trees. It didn't look like much. Just another forgotten place in the middle of a city that had long since stopped caring. But as they stepped inside, Bob was surprised. There were mattresses strewn across the floor, makeshift walls of blankets and cardboard, and small fire pits where a few others were gathered, huddling together against the cold. It wasn't much, but to Bob, it felt like the closest thing to a home he'd had in years. This is where we crash for now, Leo explained, dropping his bag onto one of the mattresses. It's not safe out there, not for kids like us. But here, you'll find people who'll look out for you. We all got our scars, but we stick together. Bob hesitated for a moment, still unsure. The sight of other kids, some older, some younger, stirred up emotions he had long buried. He had never truly belonged anywhere. Not since his mother left. Not since the streets became his only family. He looked around, noting the guarded expressions of the others. They were survivors, each carrying their own pain. But for once, he didn't feel like an outsider. How long have you been here? Bob asked quietly, still standing by the door. Leo shrugged, tossing his jacket onto the mattress. Too long. Long enough to know that nothing stays the same. Tomorrow, someone might be gone, or we might have to move. But today, we survive. Bob thought about his own life, how every day he'd woken up with nothing, how he'd made it through another day of hunger, of fear, of loneliness. He had learned to fight for scraps, to run when the danger was too close, to trust only himself. But here, with Leo and the others, he felt something he hadn't felt in ages: hope. It wasn't a strong, burning fire yet, but it was there, flickering in the back of his mind. Leo dropped down onto one of the mattresses and motioned for Bob to join him. Sit, get some rest. You're safe here, For now, Bob hesitated before sitting down, pulling his knees to his chest. He couldn't let go of the image of the man who had been murdered, the blood staining the concrete, the cold, dead eyes. His chest tightened, and he found it hard to breathe. The memory weighed on him like a heavy stone, crushing everything else beneath it. Leo must have noticed, because he leaned forward slightly, his voice softer than before. You don't have to talk about it, not yet, but the streets are full of things you can't unsee. If you want to survive, you'll have to let some of it go. It's the only way. Bob nodded, though he didn't fully understand. Could he really let go of what he had seen? The murder, the killer's face, the fear that had gripped him as he ran. It felt like it would stay with him forever. But maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to forget, even for a little while. As Bob lay down on the mattress, exhaustion pulling at him like a tide, he couldn't help but feel the tiniest flicker of relief. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to close his eyes, trusting that he wasn't completely alone in this world. Bob woke up to the faint sound of murmurs and the crackling of a small fire in the corner of the room. The sun had barely risen, and the cool morning air lingered in the old building, but the warmth of the fire was enough to make Bob feel like he could stay here forever. For the first time in a long time, he felt the smallest sense of security, but even that felt fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes, and glanced around the room. Leo was talking quietly to a few older kids near the fire, his voice low but firm. The others in the room were still asleep, wrapped in layers of old blankets and makeshift sheets. Despite the cold and the uncertainty of life on the streets, there was a strange sense of normalcy here, a strange sense of belonging that Bob wasn't sure he was ready to accept. As he stood up and stretched, trying to shake off the stiffness in his limbs, Bob's thoughts drifted back to the events of the day before. The murder, the killer. He could still see the blood, still hear the screams echoing in his mind. The image haunted him, making his stomach churn. He had witnessed something no child should have to see, and it left a scar that he wasn't sure how to heal. Hey, you all right? Leo's voice broke through his thoughts, and Bob looked up to see him standing near the doorway, watching him carefully. Bob hesitated before nodding. He didn't want to talk about it, not yet. But the weight of the memory was pressing down on him, and he could feel his chest tightening, like the walls of the room were closing in. I'm fine, Bob said, his voice hoarse, though he knew it wasn't true. Just tired. Leo seemed to understand, and for a moment there was a long silence between them. The older boy finally spoke, his voice soft but steady. You can't keep running from it, you know. The stuff you've seen. It'll catch up to you eventually, but when it does, you'll need someone to help carry the weight. The streets are rough, and the world doesn't care about us, Bob. We gotta look out for each other. You don't have to do this alone. Bob's heart skipped a beat at Leo's words. It wasn't the first time someone had told him that he wasn't alone, but somehow it felt different coming from Leo. The boy's eyes weren't just full of survival, they were full of understanding, of someone who had been through the same kind of pain and loss. Thanks, Bob muttered, unsure what else to say. He had never been good with words, never been good at expressing what he felt. But somehow, Leo's presence was enough. Come on, Leo said, standing up. We're going out to grab something to eat. Stay close and keep your eyes open. Bob nodded and followed Leo outside. The morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale golden light over the city's broken streets. The world still seemed cold, indifferent, but there was something in the air today, a faint sense of possibility that Bob couldn't quite explain. The two of them walked through the back streets, past piles of trash and abandoned cars, heading toward a market that was still setting up for the day. Bob's stomach growled, and he couldn't help but glance at the food stalls, the smell of fresh bread and fruit making his mouth water. He hadn't had a decent meal in days. But as they neared the market, a figure stepped out from an alley, blocking their path. Bob tensed, instinctively taking a step back. The man was tall, dressed in a long, dark coat, and his eyes were hidden beneath the brim of a hat. Bob could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. There was something about the man that sent a chill down his spine. Leo didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his posture relaxed, but alert, his eyes never leaving the stranger. "What do you want?" Leo asked, his voice calm but firm. The man smiled, a crooked grin that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm looking for a friend of mine," he said, his tone smooth, almost mocking. "A little boy saw something he shouldn't have." Bob's blood ran cold, his breath catching in his throat. The words hit him like a slap to the face. The killer. The man was here, searching for him. Leo's eyes narrowed. "You're wasting your time. We don't have anything for you." The stranger stepped closer, his smile never fading. "Oh, I think you do. And when I find him, we'll have a little chat." Just a friendly chat. Bob's heart raced in his chest, and before he could think, he grabbed Leo's arm, pulling him away. "We need to go." Now, Leo didn't argue. He grabbed Bob's hand and pulled him along, pushing through the crowd as the man's voice faded behind them. "This isn't over," he called, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. The chase was on again. Bob's heart was pounding in his chest, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps as he sprinted alongside Leo through the crowded market streets. The sounds of the city were all around him, a blur of voices, footsteps, and the clatter of metal carts. But all Bob could hear was the rush of his own blood in his ears, the urgency of their flight. Leo didn't say a word as they pushed through the crowd, his grip on Bob's hand firm, but reassuring. They had to get away from the man, whoever he was, before it was too late. The streets, once familiar and full of possibilities, now felt like a maze of dead ends and hidden threats. The city had always been a battleground, but now it was a prison. Bob's mind raced. The killer hadn't just come after him yesterday. He had found them again today. The man had seen Bob's face, had recognized him as the witness to the murder. Bob's stomach twisted at the thought. It wasn't just the threat of the killer that scared him. It was the realization that the boy, the one who had taken him in, might be in danger now too. "Leo, we can't outrun him forever," Bob panted, glancing over his shoulder. His eyes scanned the faces in the crowd, but the tall, dark figure wasn't there yet. He was still behind them somewhere, closing in. Leo's eyes were sharp, his focus unwavering. "We don't have to outrun him. We just need to make sure we're never in the same place twice. Stay alert and don't stop moving." The words barely registered in Bob's mind. His thoughts were consumed by the fear of what would happen if they didn't escape, if the man caught up to them. He had already witnessed one murder, and he wasn't sure if he could survive another encounter. Kind of cold, calculated violence. The alleyways seemed to close in on them, narrowing as they hurried through the twisting paths. The city's gray concrete towers loomed over them like silent giants, indifferent to the dangers below. Bob didn't know where they were going. He was too caught up in the moment, too focused on running. Leo seemed to know the way, though. He moved with a purpose, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. They turned another corner, slipping into an even quieter street. This one was lined with old shops, their windows boarded up, and the occasional flickering neon sign that seemed to give the street a false sense of life. Bob barely had time to register the change before Leo grabbed his arm and pulled him into the shadows of an abandoned store. "Stay here," Leo whispered, his voice low but urgent. "I'm going to see if I can lose him." Bob nodded, his heart still hammering in his chest. He crouched down behind a pile of discarded cardboard boxes, trying to make himself as small as possible. The cold concrete beneath him felt sharp against his skin, but the sensation barely registered. All he could think about was the killer, the man who was hunting him down, determined to make sure he didn't survive to tell anyone what he had seen. Minutes felt like hours as they waited in the silence, the only sound the distant hum of traffic and the rustling of the wind through the cracks in the building. Bob's breath was coming in shallow bursts, his body tense, every nerve on edge. It was only when he heard footsteps in the distance that he knew the man was near. He held his breath, barely daring to move. The footsteps grew louder, and Bob's heart leapt into his throat. He wanted to run, wanted to escape, but Leo had told him to stay. So he stayed, barely able to control the panic that was rising in him. The man's shadow peered around the corner, tall and dark, his presence sending a chill through Bob's entire body. He stopped at the entrance to the alley, his eyes scanning the street with a calm, calculated look. Bob held his breath, praying that Leo was right, that they could escape this. The killer stepped forward, moving slowly, deliberately. His eyes flicked over the buildings, his gaze narrowing as he passed the alley where Bob was hiding. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped, like the world was holding its breath. But then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the killer moved on, disappearing back into the maze of the city. Bob let out a slow, shaky breath, relief washing over him. They had made it. For now, Leo appeared from the shadows a moment later, his face serious, but unreadable. "That was too close," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Bob nodded, his chest still tight with fear. "What do we do now?" Leo's expression softened slightly as he looked at Bob. "Now, we keep moving. We can't stay in one place for too long. If we want to survive this, we need to stay one step ahead of him." Bob nodded. Again, his mind still reeling. He had known the streets were dangerous, but this was something else. He wasn't just a street kid anymore. He was a target, and the hunt had only just begun. The city stretched out before Bob like a labyrinth, its streets winding and twisting, full of danger at every turn. Each corner seemed to hide another threat, another way for the world to swallow him whole. For the first time in his life, Bob felt like he was truly being hunted. The streets had always been unpredictable, but now they felt suffocating, like there was nowhere left to run. Leo led the way, his eyes sharp, his every movement calculated. They moved in silence, both aware of the tension that hung in the air. It was like the city itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Bob followed him closely, his mind racing with thoughts of the killer, of the man who was still out there, looking for him, waiting to strike. "Where are we going?" Bob finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. Leo didn't answer immediately. He kept his eyes on the path ahead, his face grim. They passed through several alleys and empty streets, moving deeper into the city. The farther they went, the more abandoned the area seemed. The buildings grew taller, their windows boarded up, and the air smelled of decay. It was a part of the city Bob had never seen before. "A safe house," Leo finally answered, his tone flat. "It's hidden. A place to lay low for a while." Bob didn't question it. He trusted Leo, even if he didn't fully understand what was going on. He didn't know where else to go, who else to trust. The streets had taught him that survival was all that mattered, but in this moment, he realized that survival meant more than just staying alive. It meant finding a way to live without being swallowed whole by the world around him. They continued walking, the silence between them growing heavier with each step. Bob's stomach growled, reminding him just how little he had eaten recently. He had learned to ignore hunger, to push it aside as just another part of life. But today, it felt different. Every pang of hunger seemed to echo in his mind, reminding him of everything he had lost. Suddenly, Leo stopped in his tracks, his body tensing. Bob froze, his heart racing, as he strained to listen. In the distance, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps that were too deliberate, too slow. They were being followed. Bob's pulse quickened. He could feel the familiar sense of panic rising in his chest, but Leo didn't seem concerned. The older boy simply motioned for Bob to stay quiet and took a step back into the shadows, pulling him with him. Bob's breath caught in his throat as they ducked behind a dumpster, trying to stay as still as possible. Through the cracks between the metal, Bob saw the silhouette of the killer. He was walking down the street, his head turned slightly as if he were searching, scanning every corner for any sign of Bob. The killer stopped for a moment, his gaze drifting in Bob's direction. For a split second, their eyes locked. Bob's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't look away. The man's eyes were cold, empty, and in that moment, Bob knew that if they didn't leave soon, he wouldn't make it out alive. Leo's grip tightened on Bob's arm, and without a word, he pulled him further into the shadows, deeper into the alley. Bob's heart hammered in his chest, but he didn't make a sound. He couldn't afford to. They moved quickly now, sticking to the back streets, weaving through alleys and side passages, trying to stay out of sight. The world around them blurred, a mix of faded graffiti and decaying buildings. Every corner felt like a trap, and every step seemed to echo louder than the last. As they approached the safe house, Bob felt the tension in his chest slowly begin to loosen. They were almost there, almost safe. But then, just as they rounded the final corner, a voice rang out behind them. "Running won't save you, kid," Bob's heart skipped a beat as he whipped around to see the killer standing at the end of the alley, a cruel smile spreading across his face. He had followed them. Leo didn't hesitate. He grabbed Bob by the arm and yanked him forward, sprinting toward the door of the safe house. Bob's legs felt heavy, his muscles screaming in protest, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. They had to get inside. They had to survive. The killer was close now. Bob could hear his footsteps, quick and steady, as he closed in on them. The door of the safe house was just ahead, but Bob felt like it was miles away. Leo slammed his shoulder against the door, pushing it open just as the killer reached them. They spilled inside, the door slamming shut behind them with a force that shook the walls. Bob barely had time to catch his breath before Leo pulled him down a dark hallway, the sound of the killer's pounding footsteps growing fainter behind them. They stopped in a small, windowless room, the door locking securely behind them. Bob's chest was heaving and his mind was racing, but Leo didn't give him a chance to speak. "We stay here until we're sure it's safe," Leo said, his voice low and serious. "This place is hidden, but that doesn't mean we're safe forever. We need to rest, get some food, and plan our next move." Bob nodded, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. The killer was still out there. The hunt wasn't over, but for now, at least, they had a moment of respite. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for the first time in a long time, Bob felt like he wasn't entirely alone. Bob sat against the cold wall of the small room, his legs pulled up to his chest. He was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but his mind refused to quiet. The adrenaline from their narrow escape still buzzed in his veins, and every tiny noise in the building made him tense. The heavy door locked behind them seemed like the only thing standing between them and the danger lurking outside, but Bob knew better than to let his guard down. Leo paced the small room, his expression distant. The older boy hadn't spoken much since they arrived, his mind clearly working on something Bob couldn't yet understand. Every now and then, Leo would glance at Bob, as if checking to see if the boy was all right. But Bob could feel the weight of the silence. It wasn't just fear that held them captive here. It was uncertainty. The killer, the man who had hunted Bob through the streets, was still out there. And Leo knew it. He knew that being in a safe house didn't guarantee safety. Bob's stomach growled, a harsh reminder of the hunger gnawing at him. He hadn't had a proper meal in days, and the thought of food made his mouth water. But there was no time for that now. The streets had taught him that survival came first. Always. Leo stopped pacing and looked at Bob, his eyes narrowing as if making a decision. "You hungry?" he asked. Bob nodded, his eyes lighting up at the simple question. He hadn't realized how much he needed food until now, and the thought of something to fill his stomach felt like a distant luxury. "Stay here," Leo said, his voice steady but commanding. "I'll be right back." Bob barely had time to process the order before Leo disappeared out the door, leaving him alone in the dim, windowless room. Bob leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment. The silence was almost unbearable. It wasn't the kind of silence he was used to, the quiet of the streets, where every corner held the potential for danger. No, this silence was different. It felt heavy, like it was waiting for something to break it. He wasn't sure how long Leo had been gone when he heard footsteps approaching from the hallway. Bob's heart jumped, and he scrambled to his feet, instinctively moving to the corner of the room where he could be out of sight. But before he could react, the door opened, and Leo stepped inside, holding a small bag of food. "I got us some supplies," Leo said, setting the bag down on the floor between them. "It's not much, but it'll keep us going for now." Bob didn't hesitate. He grabbed the bag, tearing it open with shaking hands. Inside were a few pieces of stale bread, some canned beans, and a couple of bruised apples. It wasn't the feast he had imagined, but it was more than enough to quiet the gnawing hunger in his stomach. He ate quickly, not caring about the taste. For once, the food was a comfort, a reminder that they were still alive, still fighting. Leo watched him for a moment before sitting down across from him, his eyes still distant. "We can't stay here forever," he said softly. "The city's too big for us to hide for long. We'll have to leave soon, find a place where the killer can't reach us." Bob nodded, his mouth full, but the words didn't register at first. He was still focused on the food, the simple act of filling his stomach. But as the words sank in, a wave of realization hit him. The fear that had been lingering in the back of his mind for days was suddenly clearer than ever. The killer wasn't just some random threat. He was part of a larger, more dangerous world that Bob had been dragged into. And Leo, the one person who had taken him in, was no longer just an ally. He was now a target too. "What do we do now?" Bob asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Leo sighed, rubbing his face with his hand. "We stay smart. We keep moving. We can't let him track us down. But we'll need help. We'll need to find people who know how to fight back, people who can protect us." Bob stared at Leo, trying to process what he was saying. He hadn't thought much about finding others to help. The streets had always been a solitary place for him, a place where trust was earned with every passing moment. But now, it seemed, survival wasn't just about getting by. It was about finding a way to take the fight to the people who had caused all of this. "I don't want to keep running," Bob said, his voice shaking slightly. "I don't want to be scared all the time. I don't want to be someone's prey." Leo's gaze softened, and he reached out, placing a hand on Bob's shoulder. "You won't have to. We'll find a way to fight back together." Bob looked up at Leo, the weight of his words sinking in. For the first time in days, he felt something stir within him, a sense of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late to change things. Maybe he could find a way to not just survive, but to fight for a life that didn't revolve around fear and hiding. Leo stood up, grabbing his bag from the floor. "We've got work to do. We'll need to gather information, find out who's behind all of this. And we need to find more allies. But for now, we stay low. Rest. You're not alone in this, Bob." Bob nodded, feeling a small spark of determination light within him. He wasn't just running anymore. He was ready to face whatever came next, whatever it took to survive, to fight, and to put an end to the nightmare that had haunted him for so long. The storm wasn't over, but maybe, just maybe, he could weather it. The hours dragged on in the small, dimly lit room. Bob sat against the wall, occasionally glancing at Leo, who was seated by the door, staring at the street outside through a small crack. The world outside seemed so far away, the sounds of the city muffled and distant, like a ghost of the real world. Bob couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter how much they hid, the killer would find them. The city was too big, too full of eyes watching from the shadow. The stale bread and the half-empty can of beans had done little to ease his hunger, and the quiet tension in the air left Bob restless. Every noise outside made him jump. Every creak in the building felt like an omen. Leo seemed to be the only one able to remain calm, his eyes constantly scanning, calculating. Bob didn't understand how Leo did it, how he could stay so steady in the face of danger. But for now, Bob tried to do the same, to push his fear aside, to force himself to stay focused. Leo finally broke the silence, his voice low. "We need to get some supplies. We can't stay holed up forever. It's only a matter of time before someone finds us." Bob nodded, his mind still swirling with what had happened over the past few days. It felt like a nightmare that wouldn't end, a murderer hunting him, a world of shadows where trust was a currency, and every move could be your last. Leo stood up and adjusted his jacket. "Stay here and stay quiet. If you hear anything, any footsteps, you go to the back of the building. You wait for me. Understood?" Bob swallowed hard and nodded again. He didn't want to stay alone, but he trusted Leo. For all the danger they faced, Leo had kept him alive so far. That was something Bob hadn't had in a long time, someone looking out for him. And for once, the streets didn't feel so endless, not with Leo by his side. With that, Leo left the room, the door clicking softly behind him. Bob's eyes never left the door for a long moment. He felt trapped, isolated. The room, though small and hidden, was a cage in its own way. The weight of everything they had just survived pressed down on him. The sounds of the street outside felt like a reminder of how easy it was for the world to slip through his fingers. He stood up and walked over to the tiny window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peer outside. The street below was quiet for the moment. No sign of movement, no suspicious figures. Just the normal hustle of the city, the slow march of the world that didn't care who was hiding or who was running for their life. But Bob's heart raced anyway. He knew better than to trust the quiet. Minutes passed like hours. Bob checked the door, then the window again. It was then that he heard it, the faint sound of a door creaking, soft footsteps in the hall. His pulse quickened and his breath caught in his throat. The building felt smaller, the shadows longer as the footsteps grew louder. They were getting closer. Bob backed away from the window, his heart thumping in his chest. He had only one option now. He had to go. He didn't know if it was Leo returning or someone else, but he wasn't taking any chances. He moved toward the back of the room, his body tense, every nerve on alert. His eyes were fixed on the door. The footsteps stopped just outside, and for a moment there was complete silence. Bob's chest tightened as the seconds dragged on. Then creaked, the door slowly pushed open. Bob held his breath, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife he had hidden in his jacket pocket, the cold steel reassuring in his grip. He didn't know who was on the other side of the door, but he wasn't going down without a fight. The door opened fully, and Bob's eyes met the figure standing in the doorway. It wasn't the killer. It wasn't anyone who meant him harm. It was Leo, looking tired but unharmed, a small bag of supplies in his hands. Bob let out a shaky breath, lowering the knife, and his heart began to slow. Leo stepped into the room, closing the door behind him, and gave Bob a reassuring, "You all right?" Bob nodded, still trying to steady himself. "I thought," he trailed off, shaking his head. "I thought it was him." Leo set the bag down and smiled faintly. "I told you to stay quiet, didn't I?" Bob couldn't help but laugh, though it was short and strained. "Guess I didn't listen very well." Leo rolled his eyes, but there was a glimmer of something like amusement in his expression. He pulled out a couple of cans of food, a few pieces of fruit, and some water. "Eat. You look like you're about to collapse." Bob didn't need to be told twice. His hands trembled slightly as he grabbed a can of beans and dug into the food, his stomach roaring in protest. He hadn't realized just how badly he needed the nourishment. Leo watched him for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. "We're not out of this yet," he said after a while, "but we'll be ready when the time comes. We don't fight the fight we want. We fight the fight we have to." Bob nodded, swallowing the last bit of the food, and looked at Leo. "I don't want to keep running." Leo's eyes softened for a moment, but the seriousness returned almost instant. "No one wants to run, but when it's your life on the line, sometimes running is the only thing you can do. We'll figure it out, Bob. I promise." Bob glanced out the small window once more, his mind racing. For the first time, he wasn't sure whether he wanted the storm to come or to stay hidden away forever. But as Leo moved to check the supplies, Bob felt a sense of determination settle in his chest. The fight was coming, and when it did, he would be ready. They both would be. The night was heavy with uncertainty, the kind of oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow everything whole. Bob lay awake on the floor, his eyes wide open as he stared at the cracks in the ceiling above him. Every sound, every shift in the building made his muscles tense. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The calm that had settled in the room was deceptive. This silence was just the eye of the storm. Leo, meanwhile, slept across the room, his breathing steady but his posture alert, like a man ready to spring into action at any moment. Bob envied him. It seemed like Leo had this instinct, this ability to stay calm in the face of chaos. He wanted to be the kind of person who could handle everything that came his way. But right now, all he could think about was the killer who was still out there, and the grim reality that their chances of staying safe were growing slimmer with each passing hour. The city outside hummed softly, indifferent to the battle Bob and Leo were fighting. For all the noise, all the life in the streets, it felt like they were invisible, ghosts in a world that didn't care about them. A sound broke through Bob's thoughts, a soft, barely noticeable thud. His heart skipped a beat as he turned his head toward the door. Leo remained motionless, his face shadowed in the dim light. Bob strained his ears, waiting, watching for any further movement. The thud came again, louder this time. It was followed by the scrape of metal against concrete. Leo's eyes snapped open, instantly alert. Bob's stomach clenched as Leo slowly sat up, his expression unreadable. He gestured for Bob to stay silent, and Bob nodded, trying to quell the rising fear in his chest. Leo moved toward the door, checking the small peephole before quietly opening it just a crack. Bob could only watch, his body stiff, his breath held tight. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a voice low and cautious floated into the room. "Leo, you in there?" Bob's heart skipped another beat. He knew that voice. It was familiar, too familiar. Leo glanced back at Bob, his brow furrowed, and then opened the door just enough to let the figure inside. Bob's eyes widened as the person stepped into the room. It was a girl, maybe a year or two older than Bob, with messy brown hair and a wild look in her eyes. She had a weary frame, clearly built from years of survival, and a look of quiet defiance. She wasn't just anyone Bob had seen her before, in the streets, in the alleys. She was part of the group of street kids that Leo had warned him about, a loose network of survivors who knew how to make it through the city without getting caught. "Thought I lost you too," the girl said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "It's getting worse out there. People are getting desperate." Leo stepped aside to let her in fully. "What are you talking about?" "They're getting organized," the girl said, her voice tinged with urgency. "The killers, the ones behind all of this, they've started working together. And now, they've got eyes everywhere. You can't hide anymore. They know where we are, Leo. They're coming for us." Bob's stomach dropped as he processed her words. The killers weren't just after him anymore. They were after everyone. The entire underground network of kids like him. They were no longer just isolated incidents of violence. They were part of a larger operation. Leo's face hardened as he turned to Bob. "We can't run anymore. It's time to fight back." Bob's breath caught in his throat. The words felt surreal. Fight back? He had always been just a survivor, someone who ran when he had to, someone who hid when danger loomed too large. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't someone who stood up against the people who hunted him. He was just trying to make it through the day. And now, Leo was asking him to take a stand. But there was something about the way Leo spoke, the way the girl's words hung in the air, that made Bob feel like this was inevitable. The fight wasn't something they could choose anymore. It was something that had been thrust upon them. If they were going to survive, they had to confront it head on. "Who else knows about this?" Leo asked the girl. She looked around, her eyes flicking toward Bob before answering. "A few of us. The ones who know how to move through the city without getting caught. But we need your help, Leo. You know how they operate. You know how to get in and out without leaving a trace." Bob looked at Leo, waiting for his response. He didn't know what to think anymore. He had never been part of something bigger than himself, never been part of a team. And yet, in this moment, he realized he didn't have a choice. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for something more, for the chance to take back control, to stop being hunted. Leo took a deep breath, his gaze hardening. "We'll do it, but we need a plan." The girl nodded, stepping forward. "There's a place, a warehouse down by the old docks. It's where they're gathering. We can't get in without a fight, but we can't wait much longer. The longer we stay hidden, the more they close in on us." Leo turned to Bob. "Are you ready for this?" Bob swallowed hard, feeling a mixture of fear and something else, a spark of defiance, maybe. He wasn't sure where it came from, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had something to fight for. "I don't have much choice, do I?" Bob said quietly, his voice steady despite the nerves gnawing at him. Leo smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "No, you don't." The plan was set. As Leo and the girl, whose name Bob learned was Mia, mapped out their strategy, Bob couldn't shake the feeling of inevitability that had settled in his gut. They were going to the old docks, a place long abandoned by the city's heartless system. It was a place full of rusting warehouses, rotting wood, and shadows, the perfect spot for those who needed to disappear or carry out their business unseen. The perfect place for people who had been forgotten by the world. Mia's voice broke through Bob's thoughts as she paced back and forth, detailing the layout of the warehouse where the killers were meeting. "There's a back entrance, hidden by a set of shipping containers. It's narrow, and you have to be quick getting in and out, but it'll keep us off their radar. They don't expect anyone to come through there. We'll need to be in and out fast." Leo nodded, His eyes narrowed as he studied the map that Mia had drawn. Bob, despite his growing anxiety, watched quietly. He wasn't a strategist. He wasn't used to thinking in terms of escape routes or planning ambushes. But he understood one thing now. Running wasn't going to save him. The killers were closing in on them, and if they didn't act soon, they'd be sitting ducks, waiting to be picked off one by one. "We move at night," Leo said, breaking the silence. "It'll be harder for them to spot us if it's dark. The cover of night is our best chance." Mia glanced at Bob, her gaze sharp. "You sure you're ready for this?" Bob hesitated for a moment. He had never fought back before. His entire life had been spent avoiding danger, running from it, hiding when it came too close. But after everything that had happened, the murder he witnessed, the killer chasing him, the fear of never knowing if he'd wake up the next day, it felt like something inside him was shifting. He didn't want to be hunted anymore. He didn't want to be the prey. "I'm ready," Bob said, his voice firm despite the nerves bubbling under his skin. "We can't keep running," Leo smiled, though it was tinged with the weight of what was to come. "Good. We'll need everyone on their toes." With the plan set in motion, the next few hours passed in a blur of preparation. Leo and Mia gathered what supplies they could, making sure they had enough food and water for the night. Bob didn't need much. He had learned to survive on very little, but the reality of the mission ahead weighed on him. By the time dusk fell, the city had transformed into something darker, more dangerous. The usual hum of life had quieted, replaced by the distant sounds of the night. Sirens in the distance, the occasional car passing by. But for the most part, it was quiet. Too quiet. Bob's thoughts raced as he followed Leo and Mia through the back streets, their footsteps muffled against the cracked pavement. Every sound made him jump. Every shadow felt like it was watching him. The city, for all its noise, was a place of hidden dangers, and tonight they would be walking straight into one. As they approached the docks, the smell of salt water and decay hit Bob's senses. The once bustling waterfront now felt like a forgotten relic of the past, its once proud warehouses now leaning to one side, with rusted beams and broken windows. "We're close," Leo whispered, signaling for them to slow down. "Stay close and stay quiet." Bob nodded, his heart hammering in his chest. The closer they got to the warehouse, the more intense the fear became. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was a fight, a chance to take back control of his life. And though he was scared, deep down, there was something else, to a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be the turning point. They crept around the side of the warehouse, where a stack of shipping containers provided cover. Bob's breath came in shallow bursts, his body tense, every muscle alert. He could see the dim light from inside the warehouse flickering through cracks in the walls, shadows moving inside. Mia crouched down beside the entrance, signaling for them to stop. "This is it. We go. In fast. Hit them hard and get out. No hesitation. Got it?" Bob nodded again, his heart pounding harder than before. There was no going back now. Leo looked at each of them in turn, his eyes meeting Bob's. "Ready?" Bob swallowed hard, his hand tight around the knife he had hidden in his jacket pocket. He wasn't sure what he was ready for, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let fear control him anymore. "I'm ready," Bob said, his voice steady this time, more sure than he had ever been. Leo gave him a brief nod, then turned to Mia. "Let's move." They slid through the narrow gap in the shipping containers, moving as quietly as possible. The sounds from inside the warehouse grew louder, and Bob's mind raced with the possibilities of what awaited them. They could be walking into a trap. They could be outnumbered, overpowered, and caught in the middle of a fight they weren't ready for. But as they reached the back door of the warehouse, Leo paused, holding up his hand. They stopped, breathless in the darkness, waiting for the signal. A moment later, Leo nodded, and they moved in. The warehouse loomed before them, its dark, open doors barely illuminated by flickering lights from inside. The air was thick with the scent of rust, old wood, and salt water from the nearby docks. Every step Bob took felt like a step deeper into a world he didn't know, a world that had been hidden from him until now. The faint sound of murmurs echoed from within, and Bob's heart raced, faster with every footstep. Leo led the way, his movements precise and silent, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. Mia followed closely behind, her eyes scanning every shadow, every corner of the warehouse. Bob stayed in the middle, trying to match their pace, though his legs felt like lead. He wasn't used to this, moving like a shadow through the night, waiting for an enemy that might be lurking just out of sight. They reached the door, and Leo pressed his ear to the frame. For a moment, everything was still. Then slowly, he pushed the door open just a crack, peering inside. The light was dim, and the air inside smelled stale, but Bob could make out shapes moving in the shadows. "We'll need to move fast," Leo whispered, his voice low and urgent. "We hit them hard and quick." No hesitation, Mia nodded, her face grim. "You take the left side. I'll cover the right." "Bob, stay close to Leo. Don't go off on your own." Bob felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. He had no experience in combat, no knowledge of how to fight in a place like this. The only thing he knew was that they were here to stop the killers, to take back control of their lives. Leo's eyes met Bob's. "Stick with me, all right? We get in, we get out." Fast, Bob swallowed, his grip tightening on the knife in his jacket pocket. He had to do this. There was no going back now. "Got it," he whispered. With a swift motion, Leo pushed the door open wider, stepping into the warehouse with Mia close behind. Bob followed, his heart hammering in his chest. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the thick layers of dust on the floor. As they entered, Bob could hear the voices more clearly now, coming from the far side of the room. They were low, hushed, but there was an unmistakable edge to them. They were talking about something, plans, deals, maybe something worse. Bob didn't want to know. All he wanted was to get through this alive. They crouched behind a row of crates, the low murmurs of the killers still audible ahead. Leo's eyes flicked to Bob, and with a small nod, he gestured toward the far side of the warehouse where the men were gathered. There were at least 5 of them, each one standing near a makeshift table littered with papers and maps, their backs to the entrance. This was it. This was the moment Bob had been dreading and waiting for. Leo didn't wait for a second longer. With the speed of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, he sprang from behind the crates, moving quickly and silently toward the men. Mia followed, darting to the right to flank them. Bob hesitated, frozen for a brief second by the overwhelming weight of the moment. He could hear the voices of the men, now louder as they argued, their backs still turned. His stomach twisted with anxiety, but then Leo's voice cut through the air. Now, without thinking, Bob surged forward, following Leo's lead. He sprinted across the room, the sound of his own footsteps pounding in his ears. As he reached the first man, he saw Leo take down another one with brutal efficiency, knocking him out cold before the man had a chance to react. Bob wasn't sure what to do. He wasn't a fighter, but his body moved instinctively. He grabbed the nearest man by the arm, pulling him to the ground with a force that surprised even him. The man shouted, reaching for a knife at his belt, but Bob was faster. He shoved the blade of his own knife against the man's neck, the sharp edge biting into his skin. "Stay down," Bob hissed, his voice shaky but steady. He didn't know where the words came from, but they were enough to make the man freeze, fear flashing across his face. Behind him, he heard the sound of more men moving, more shouts, but Leo and Mia were already engaged, each one taking down a man with precise, calculated strikes. It was chaos, but it was the kind of chaos Bob could handle. The chaos of survival, the chaos of not knowing whether or not you were going to make it out alive. Bob moved quickly, his heart thudding in his chest as he tried to process what was happening. The warehouse, once quiet and full of secrets, was now a battleground. Leo and Mia were closing in on the last 2 men, and Bob was stuck with the one he had tackled to the ground. The man struggled beneath him, but Bob held him down, keeping the knife close to his throat. His mind raced as he wondered how much longer this would last. How long before the others came looking for them? How long before they were outnumbered? "Stay down," Bob repeated, the words now almost a mantra, as if saying them could make it all real. He was here, he was fighting, and somehow he was going to make it out of this alive. With one last, swift move, Leo knocked out the final man, and the warehouse fell silent. The fight was over. Bob took a shaky breath, his body trembling from the adrenaline of it all. He had done it. He had fought back, and he had survived. Leo approached him first, his face still serious, but his eyes softer now. "You did good," he said quietly, his voice low. "You stayed with me. You didn't panic." Bob could hardly believe it. He hadn't panicked. He had actually fought. For the first time in what felt like forever, he realized something deep within him. The fear, the feeling of being hunted, wasn't all there was. He could fight back. He could survive. And no matter what came next, he wasn't going to let anyone take that from him. Mia joined them, her face unreadable, but her stance relaxed. "We need to go. They'll have backup soon." Leo nodded, his expression hardening again as he looked toward the door. "Let's move." Bob didn't need to be told twice. He was ready for whatever came next. The adrenaline from the fight still coursed through Bob's veins, his body buzzing with the aftereffects of the chaotic struggle. As Leo, Mia, and Bob quickly moved toward the exit, their feet barely making a sound on the warehouse floor, the weight of the moment began to settle in. They had just taken down the killer's people who had been hunting them, but the reality of what they'd done didn't hit until the warehouse door slammed shut behind them. They were still alive. They had survived. But Bob knew that the danger wasn't over. It wasn't close to being over. They had made their move, struck when they had the chance. But now, the killers would be coming for them. No more hiding. No more running. The warehouse stood silent behind them, its shadows now filled with the heavy silence of the aftermath. The smell of salt and decay still lingered in the air, but Bob barely noticed it. His focus was elsewhere, on the streets ahead, on the road that lay before them. The city was alive, pulsing with the faint hum of cars and the occasional shout from a distant alleyway. But to Bob, it all felt like an alien world, a world that had just been forever changed by his actions. "Move fast," Leo whispered, his voice low and urgent. "We've got to get to the safe house. We've made noise, and now everyone's going to be looking for us." Bob nodded, his eyes scanning the darkened street ahead. He could feel the weight of Leo's words pressing on him. They were in this together, but now, more than ever, they needed to stay one step ahead of the people who wanted them gone. Mia moved swiftly beside them, her pace matching Leo's, her eyes constantly darting from side to side. Bob could tell she was ready for whatever came next. She had seen the darkness of the streets, had lived through the kind of dangers that Bob had only begun to understand. She was a survivor. "Do you think they'll come after us right away?" Bob asked, his voice quiet but filled with the raw tension of uncertainty. "They'll come. They always do," Leo replied, his eyes scanning the street ahead. "But we don't have time to waste on that. We need to regroup and get ready. They won't stop, Bob. They'll want us dead." "It's not over." Bob felt the weight of his words. Leo was right. This was only the beginning. They had just drawn a line in the sand, but the killers wouldn't rest until they erased it. They were far from safe. They turned a corner, entering a narrow alley that led toward an underground safe house that Leo had mentioned earlier. The path was darker here, more isolated, but it felt like the only place they could go. Bob's steps slowed as they neared the entrance, his mind still processing the reality of the situation. They had just taken down men who were more than just criminals. They were a part of something bigger, something dangerous. Leo stopped in front of a rusted metal door, and after a quick glance around, he knocked twice in a distinct rhythm. Bob watched as the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room beyond. Inside, a few familiar faces greeted them, other street kids, survivors who had been part of the underground network for as long as anyone could remember. The room was small, barely furnished, but it was enough to feel like a refuge. "Get in," Leo ordered, ushering Bob and Mia inside. Once they were all inside, Leo shut the door quietly, locking it behind them. "Are we safe here?" Bob asked, his voice low as he took in the room. "For now," Leo replied, his voice steady. "But we can't stay here forever. We'll lay low for a while, but we need to figure out our next move. The people behind this, those killers, they won't stop. They're too organized, too ruthless." Bob felt his chest tighten at the mention of the killers. They were everywhere, it seemed. They were connected to the streets, to the network of power that operated just out of sight. And now, Bob was in the middle of it all. The world he had known, the world where he was just trying to survive, was gone. Now, he was part of something bigger, and it terrified him. Mia dropped her bag onto a table, her face hard with determination. We've got to hit them before they hit us. We can't keep running. If we do, we're just waiting to be taken out. Leo nodded, his expression grim. I agree, but we need information. We need to know who we're up against, who's pulling the strings. We need to find their base, their leader, and put an end to this. But to do that, we need a plan. Bob's mind raced as he thought about what they had just done, about what they had to do next. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about fighting back, about taking control of their own fate. And he wasn't going to sit back and let others dictate how his story ended. We'll do it, Bob said suddenly, his voice steady with newfound resolve. We'll fight. We'll stop them. Leo and Mia exchanged a glance. Mia's lips curled into a small, approving smile. Leo's gaze softened for a moment before he gave a firm nod. We're in this together, Bob, Leo said. And now we fight. But we fight smart. We plan. Bob nodded, feeling the weight of their words sink in. He wasn't just running from the past anymore. He wasn't just hiding. He was taking the fight to them. The killers had come for him, for them, but they didn't know what they were up against. And soon, neither would the streets. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with anticipation. The fight was far from over, but in this moment, Bob felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. And with that, a plan began to form. The room was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long shadows across the cracked walls. Bob sat on an old wooden crate that had been pushed into a corner, his knees drawn to his chest, his mind racing with the magnitude of what they were about to do. The words from Leo and Mia echoed in his head. We fight back. We stop them. Bob had always been a survivor. He had lived through the streets, learning how to avoid danger, how to blend into the shadows and go unnoticed. But this was different. This wasn't about surviving another day. It was about taking action, about fighting back against the very people who had made him and others like him feel powerless for so long. He looked around the room at the faces of the other street kids like him, each one marked by the harshness of their lives. They weren't fighters by nature. They were survivors, just like Bob. But tonight, they would become something more. Tonight, they would become a team with a purpose. Leo and Mia were in the center of the room, gathered with a few other kids who had already set up a table covered with maps, papers, and old photographs. They were working on piecing together the puzzle of who was behind all the killings, who was pulling the strings. Bob knew the killers they had faced in the warehouse were just pawns in a much larger game. There were powerful people involved, people who had the means and the resources to make their lives miserable. Mia tapped her finger on a photo of a man in a suit. This is him, she said, pointing to the man in the picture. This is the one pulling the strings. Bob leaned forward, trying to make sense of the image. The man in the photo was older than he had expected, with slicked back gray hair and cold, calculating eyes. His suit was expensive, the kind of clothing that told you he belonged to a world Bob had only seen from a distance, a world of power, of wealth, of people who could do anything and never face the consequences. Who is he? Bob asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Leo stepped forward, his face grim. His name is Victor Greaves. He's a big shot in this city. He's got connections. Everywhere, politicians, businessmen, people with money and power. He's behind the trafficking, the disappearances, and the killings. The ones who run the streets. They answer to him. Bob's heart sank as he listened. This man, Victor Greaves, was the one who had orchestrated the world Bob and the others had been living in. The killers they had faced were just the tip of the iceberg. There was a network of people out there, operating in the shadows, making sure that kids like Bob and Leo stayed invisible, stayed disposable. And how do we get to him? Mia asked, her voice low and steady. We can't just walk into his office or find him on the street, Leo replied. We need to hit him where it hurts. We need to find his connections, his weak spots, the people who work for him. We need to find out who else is in this with him. Bob's mind raced, trying to follow the logic of the plan. He wasn't sure how much he could contribute to this. He wasn't a strategist, and he certainly wasn't a fighter. But what he did know was that he had survived by staying alert, by noticing things others overlooked. And maybe, just maybe, That was something he could bring to the table. He stood up, his legs feeling stiff from sitting for too long. "We could start by looking at where the killings happen," he said. "I mean, we've already seen where they operate. Maybe there's a pattern to it. Maybe we can find something that links them together." Leo and Mia both looked at him, and for a moment, there was silence. Then Leo nodded. "That's not a bad idea. It's a start." Mia smiled, the first real smile Bob had seen from her in a while. "I like it. Let's check the sites where the killings happen, figure out if there's anything unusual. We need to learn more about how they operate." Bob felt a small sense of relief at their approval. It wasn't much, but it was something. He was part of this now, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a purpose, a reason to fight. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was part of the team, part of something bigger. The next few days were a blur of investigation. They moved quickly, using the safe house as their base of operations while they scoured the city for clues. Bob and Mia visited the sites where the murders had taken place, talking to anyone they could find, asking questions without giving too much away. They found small pieces of information, things that didn't quite make sense, like the fact that the killings seemed to happen in areas where the city was planning redevelopment. Abandoned buildings, empty lots, places where the law was easy to ignore. Leo worked in the background, gathering intel on Victor Greaves and his associates. It wasn't easy. Greaves was untouchable in the eyes of the law, a man with so many layers of protection that getting close to him felt like trying to crack open a fortress. But Leo was relentless, following leads and tracking down any information that might give them an edge. Days turned into weeks, and the more they uncovered, the more the web seemed to unravel. It was bigger than they had thought, bigger than Bob could have imagined. Victor Greaves wasn't just involved in the killings. He was part of a larger network, a syndicate that controlled the city's underworld, running everything from drug trafficking to human trafficking to illegal arms deals. And at the center of it all was a man who had managed to stay hidden, untouched by the law, untouchable by anyone. But Bob wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to hide. They had a plan. They had each other. And now they had the knowledge to bring Greaves down. The fight was far from over, but Bob was ready for it. The plan was set. The pieces were all in place. Bob, Leo, and Mia had spent weeks gathering information, connecting dots, and tracking down the elusive threads that connected Victor Greaves to the web of crime that strangled the city. They had learned more than they ever wanted to know about the syndicate's operations, their supply routes, the money laundering schemes, and most important, the places where the killers operated with ruthless efficiency. It wasn't enough. Not yet. Not until they took down Greaves himself. The city felt different now, as if it had become a ticking time bomb. Every corner held a danger, every alley an unknown. The people who had hidden in the shadows for so long, the ones who lived in the spaces between the law and the chaos, were now under a spotlight. Bob could feel the tension, a weight hanging in the air, every step he took through the city streets. Leo stood in front of the chalkboard they had been using as their central map, scribbled with routes, notes, and names. "Tonight's the night," he said, his voice grim but resolute. "We move in, we hit the compound, and we take out Greaves. Fast, quiet. We can't afford any mistakes." Mia, standing beside him, nodded. "We've been doing this for weeks. We've got the knowledge. Now we just need to trust each other and act." Bob stood a little farther back, his mind running through everything they had learned over the past few weeks. He had never been part of anything like this. He wasn't a fighter by nature, and he wasn't used to making life or death decisions. But now, as he looked at the team, he understood one thing. This was the only chance they had to stop the violence, to stop the killing. They couldn't wait any longer. Every day that passed, more people died. "We stick to the plan," Leo continued. "We'll split up once we're in. Mia, you and Bob will handle the outside perimeter. I'll go in with the other guys and handle Greaves. We're not leaving until he's down." Bob nodded, trying to swallow the nerves that were creeping up in his throat. This was it, the moment they had all been preparing for. The culmination of every night spent in the shadows, every scrap of information they had painstakingly gathered. Greaves was their target, the one man who had been responsible for everything, the puppet master behind the carnage they had witnessed. But now He was going to pay for his actions. As the sun began to set, the streets of the city were awash in a haze of orange and pink. The lights flickered to life one by one, the hum of the city settling into a predictable rhythm. But for Bob, the rhythm was different tonight. Every car that passed by, every pedestrian walking along the sidewalk, every sound felt heightened, like the world was waiting to explode. It was time. They moved out, a few small, quiet figures against the backdrop of the city's night. Leo, Mia, and Bob together, each of them with a role to play in what would be the final battle against the forces that had tried to break them. They reached the compound just as the last traces of daylight disappeared, swallowed by the creeping shadows. The building was massive, an old industrial complex tucked away on the outskirts of the city, its walls fortified and its perimeter watched by guards. The compound had been built to keep people out, but tonight it was their entrance into the heart of darkness. Mia moved first, slipping into the shadows with the ease of someone who had lived a lifetime in the dark. Bob and Leo followed, staying low, moving as silently as possible. They knew the risks. Every step they took could be their last, but they had come too far to turn back now. They reached the back gate, the guards distracted by something further down the street. Leo motioned for Bob to stay close, and the three of them slipped inside unnoticed. The compound was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft shuffle of their footsteps on the cracked pavement. Two guards at the entrance. Mia whispered, "I'll take the one on the left." Bob nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. His hand went to the knife in his pocket, his fingers brushing the cold steel. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to feel right now. Fear? Determination? Both? Maybe. But whatever it was, he couldn't let it stop him. With Mia taking the lead, they moved forward, silently eliminating the guards one by one. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't glamorous, but it had to be done. They couldn't afford any noise. They couldn't afford to let anyone escape. The final door was ahead of them. It was the entrance to the inner sanctum of the compound, where Greaves would be. Bob could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, the finality of what they were about to do crashing down on him. The door was locked, but it didn't take long for Leo to pick the lock, his hands moving quickly, efficiently. The door creaked open, and for a moment, everything was still. Bob's heart beat louder in his chest, and he wondered if anyone else could hear it. The room beyond was dark, lit only by the faint glow of security lights. He could hear voices low, muffled, and steady coming from deeper inside. "Greaves is in there," Leo whispered, his voice barely audible. "Stay close. We go in fast." They moved together, and as they reached the inner room, Bob could hear the sound of someone laughing. Greaves. Leo was the first to step inside, his gun raised, his eyes cold and focused. Bob and Mia followed close behind, their eyes darting around the room. It was a large office, expensive furniture scattered around the space. A desk sat in the middle, papers strewn about. But Greaves wasn't sitting at the desk. He was standing near the far wall, flanked by two bodyguards. "Victor Greaves," Leo called out, his voice steady but full of authority. "We're here for you." Greaves turned, a smirk crossing his face as he took in the group standing at the door. His eyes narrowed, and Bob could see the calculation in them. "I knew you'd come," he said coolly, "but it's too late. You've already lost." But before Greaves could say anything more, Leo moved swiftly, taking down the bodyguards in a few quick, brutal movements. The room erupted into chaos. Bob's heart raced as he moved toward Greaves. The man's face twisted in shock and anger. "You think you can just come in here and take me down?" Greaves snarled, his hand reaching for something hidden under his desk. But Bob was faster. In one motion, he lunged forward, knocking the gun out of Greaves' hand and slamming him against the wall. The man gasped for air, his eyes wide with fear. "I'm not just running anymore," Bob said, his voice low and steady. "And neither are you." Greaves struggled, but Bob held him firm, knowing that this moment, the moment where he finally fought back, would change everything. With a final, decisive move, Bob secured Greaves, making sure he wouldn't hurt anyone again. It was over. Hope you enjoyed the story. Comment where you're watching from, leave a like, and subscribe to the channel.